something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
Salutations, Connecticut. This is the Readman Truth to Power Hour on 103 FM WNHHLP New Haven. We are the community radio on FM. You will hear no commercials on our show. You'll just hear Truth to Power today. And today we've got a very special guest. We got the original badass teacher. There's 70,000 badass teachers out there that are part of a Facebook group, and all of they started a resistance to mandates and stuff. But we're looking at this show today, and it's really in response to the rise of fascism in America. And we were talking just before the show, and we're just saying, like, this show is going to be focused on just say no to fascism. But anyway, Mark, Dr. Nason, could you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about you, who you are. Come on.
Sure. First of all, I'm really honored to be on this show with Jesse Turner, who's one of my favorite collaborators and a personal hero. We've worked together for the last 15 years, defending public education against attacks from everywhere, attacks which are continuing. But before we get to the subject of today's discussion, anti-fascism, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm 78 years old, grew up in a very tough part of Brooklyn, and for the last 54 years, I've been a professor of African American Studies and History at Fordham University, and I've got no plans to retire. I grew up as both an athlete and an activist, and sports is still an integral part of who I am. I still play competitive tennis in my age group, play a little golf, and if necessary, we'll play football or basketball with my students. But, my passion has been exploring the history of race in America, looking at political movements, popular culture, social justice activism. And in recent years, probably the two most important things I've been doing, first was the Community History Project I helped found in 2003 called the Bronx African American History Project, which is one of the largest community-based oral history projects in the United States. And then, about 14 years ago, founding a group called the Badass Teachers Association in response to attacks on public education that were coming from across the political spectrum, from Democrats as well as Republicans. And I'm also a historian of social movements as well as a participant. So I try to bring all of that to this current, very dangerous historical moment when I see the most serious threat to this country since the 1960s with the onset of the Vietnam War. And one of the things that I want to get across today to your audience is there are certain moments in history when you have to drop everything you're doing, whether it's work-related, family-related, your passions for literature, for music, dance, whatever, for science, and fight back against something which could ruin not only your life, but the lives of everyone around you. And this doesn't happen that often in terms of people's lifetimes. I remember this happened to me during the Vietnam War. I was a civil rights activist. I was preparing to get my doctorate in history and teach about the history of race. And all of a sudden, I saw that this war that came out of nowhere was going to make it impossible for me to do the things that I wanted to do in my life. So I had to make my priority fighting this war, even if it meant sacrificing some of the other things that I cared about. And I think that this is this historic moment. So many things that we have worked for all our lives are under threat from an administration which is willing to overturn all of the firewalls that have protected us in the things we're doing and give us orders in the most intimate aspects of our life, from how we teach, how we learn, how we work, how we conduct ourselves in our families, what language we use. And I think it's the responsibility of everyone who cares about this country and everyone who cares about justice to make fighting this their major priority. Even if it involves sacrifice, even if it involves risk, even if it involves doing things you never imagined doing. And I've been telling this since the second inauguration. And when we talk, I have a lot of ideas about how to do this, some of which I've already implemented. You may see this little red button I'm wearing. It has the words IB. It's an organization I founded called Icebreakers, which is an organization that operates covertly so that nobody's identities are revealed to help fight deportations of immigrants and visa revocations of international students and political activists. And I started this organization 2 months ago with people at Fordham and people in the East End of Long Island. My students produced this button. And we organized covertly because as a historian, I believe that you cannot organize openly to resist authoritarianism. And there's a whole tradition of this in American history about how you organize covertly when the people in power control the police, control the media, have spies and infiltrators. And I want to tell you one of my favorite stories about organizing covertly. And you'll love this, Jesse, because I believe you have Irish background and ancestry.
Yes, I do.
Okay. So it's the early 1930s, the beginning of the Great Depression. And a radical organization in New York decides they're going to try to organize a union in the New York City subways. The workers in the New York City subways were almost all Irish immigrants. And they worked 12-hour days, terrible, brutal conditions. And there were spies and infiltrators everywhere. So this radical organization took a couple of Finnish guys, gave them Irish names, and had them get jobs there. And even in the Depression, you could get jobs there because people were constantly quitting or being fired because it was so oppressive. So they're organizing, and they hear about this guy who had been kicked out of Ireland for being in the IRA and resisting the Irish Free State, which he saw as collaborationist. And they heard about him, that he had a big base up in the Bronx because he was an MC at dances for Clan na Gael. So they heard, and they said, his name was Michael Quill. They tapped him in the shoulder and said, Michael, would you like to fight for the rights of people here? You can't do this publicly. Join our organization, and we will slowly recruit, one person at a time, until we're strong enough. And Michael Quill ended up becoming the head of the Transport Workers Union and the most powerful and respected union leader in the history of New York City. But that's how it started. So what I tell people in this crisis, get together with the closest friends you can trust in your school, in your neighborhood, in your workplace, and form a little, what we used to call in the 60s, affinity group. And sit down. Don't let anybody else know what you're doing. And then start figuring out who are the most vulnerable people in your community. You know, if they're immigrants, how do you, or trans people, how do you help them? And then figure out strategies to do that. Then identify the most dangerous people in your community and figure out what, if anything, you want to do about them. Probably nothing right away, but at some point down the line, those people may need to be publicly identified and isolated. So let me tell you how one of the groups operated in a real life situation. I was contacted by a teacher in a town in western Suffolk, which was very heavily MAGA. And she is a teacher in the school who had a lot of immigrant students. She said, Mark, my immigrant students are terrified during President's Week that they won't have anything to eat. They're dependent on school breakfast and lunch, but because of the fear of deportation, they're afraid to leave their houses. Could you find people willing to bring food to them in their homes during President's Week? So this is back in February. I asked about 5 people. Everyone agreed to help, including somebody from the opt-out movement who was the leader of an evangelical church out there who now has her church helping feed these students and will help feed them in the summer. At Fordham, we've connected to groups all over the New York metropolitan area, also covert, called ICE Watchers. So you can't go anywhere like in Bushwick without ICE Watch, if you're like, DHS or ICE, without people knowing it and sending out signals. There are these, so we've outmaneuvered them on the immigration issue. All over the United States, people have been organizing to inform immigrants of their rights, to help feed immigrants who are afraid to leave their homes, to find them legal defense so they can't deport people. And they've complained about it. People know their rights too much. We have to do this on every issue. We have to make everything difficult for them. And finally, people in schools are catching on. They're giving all these orders. Don't obey any of them. Make them enforce it. And think about this. They're putting enforcement of anti-DEI provisions on the Secretary of Education. At the same time, they're dismantling the Department of Education. Why should people be scared of that? They're dismantling the department. Enforcement requires staff and requires lawyers. We're tying them up in court everywhere. We can beat these people, but we can't give anything away. We have to wear them out. Wear them out by defying every order. Wear them out by suing them. And wear them out by taking to the streets in protest in huge numbers, and also when it's time to calm, beating them at the polls like they did in Wisconsin, where the Elon Musk funded, Attorney General candidate was defeated by 10 points. We're not going to go the way of Nazi Germany. But that doesn't mean that the folks we're facing can't do terrible damage. Reducing the damage means giving them nothing, fighting them on everything. And if it means you lose a grant, well, you know, that's the price you pay for standing for justice. I'm not saying this is going to be painless, but I tell my students, be prepared for 2 to 6 years of hell. But if we stand up, we will win. Give them nothing. Say no. But also, be the person in your community who sets an example of courage. So let me, 2 months ago, almost no other faculty at Fordham was taking the stance that I did. One of the first things I did after, because I saw people were so frightened, was, Jesse, at the bottom of your, college email, there's a signature, Dr. Jesse Turner, so-and-so, with your title and maybe a quote under it. So next to my name, 2 months ago, I put Dr. Nason, DEI. And at the bottom, I had a quote from Leadbelly, stay woke.
Stay woke.
And so every email I sent has DEI and woke on it. And several of my students have told me, Dr. Nason, it's so important that you took a stance when other people were so afraid. My basic position is just as fear is contagious, courage is contagious. Be the person who starts a contagion of courage in your school, in your neighborhood, in your democratic or club, in your community group. Take a stance and be the one, especially if you're somewhat protected. I wouldn't tell this to a faculty member who, is international. I wouldn't tell this to somebody, who's Black or Latine. I wouldn't tell this to somebody trans. But those of us who have some layers of privilege and protection need to make ourselves big targets so that others can step forward. And guess what? I'm still here. I'm daring them to attack me. It hasn't happened. But why? Because they don't have enough resources to go after everybody. So they take these dramatic instances, which are totally inappropriate and illegal, like this poor guy from Maryland, who they say is MS-13. Or the 2 Columbia students they pick are the people who are trying to bring together Palestinians and Jews. So they trying to terrorize us by making examples of individuals. But don't be fooled by the theater, because a lot of this is political theater designed to make you give up in advance. Make them work for everything, And this was my philosophy as an athlete, by the way. If I was playing you in tennis, I was going to put myself in such pain to win that you would have to decide, are you willing to suffer that much? And most people weren't. I'd wear them down because I was willing to take more pain than they were. And I hate to say that, but we're going to have to do that at this moment until enough of us rise up so that they're totally overwhelmed by the resistance, which I think is going to happen.
I agree with you. I want to come back to there are things where we can do bold things, but the question was, what can we do as individuals, members of organizations, to stop the rise of fashion? So one of the things with this DEI, by the way, we just won a big case in New Hampshire to blocking to this DEI crush piece that they're doing out of the White House. But coming back to this thing, teachers in general, educators, parents, one of the things I'll tell parents or teachers, they'll say, "What can I do?" Because they'll say, "Dr. Turner, you'll get arrested on the line. We know that. We've seen you do that on the picket line, on the Black Lives Matters line, on the Poor People's March, on the Union line. You've done that. You've got a history of that. You walked to D.C. You've done this your whole life. What can we do?" And I say, read a book. Do a read aloud in your class. Every time I'll be here when the Department of Defense took the Husky Airmen off their webpage, wiped their web pages clean. Well, guess what we did in the Literacy Center? We had competitions to win our gold medals. We were over here. We were reading to Husky Airmen every day. When all of a sudden Harriet Tubman disappeared from the Underground Railroad federal pages, what we did was every one of our teachers and every one of our students knew about Harriet Tubman. I tell the same to parents. If what we think is, Frederick Douglass said, once you learn to read, you're forever free. And that concept. So you can do small things. That's what I'm saying. Individuals, you can boycott things. You don't have to buy.
Look at what's going on with Tesla.
Yeah, Tesla, 70% drop in their stock.
Look what's happening with Target.
Yep. And
you have power as a consumer, but you also have power as a parent and as an educator. Teach and read banned books. Celebrate individuals who they're trying to erase.
And that's exactly
you can do
what
that
they do.
in your family. You know, I know my children are doing this with their children. In other words, you have to turn every part of your life into an act of resistance. And that's what I was saying. That's what happened during the Vietnam War. When there are certain times when normal life has to be partially suspended until you can end a really dire threat to everything you care about. So for the next couple of years, every day you wake up, what can I do today to resist? What can I do in my family? What can I do on the job? What can I do at my tennis club? So I belong to 2 tennis clubs because I'm trying to win a national championship when I'm 80. I'm in busy training. That's how crazy I am. I wear this to my club, and a bunch of people, when I explain what the button is, they said, Dr. Nason, can you give me one of those buttons so I can wear them? I just ordered a shirt which says diversity, equity, inclusion, which I'm going to use as my major tennis shirt. In other words, I'm going to be a walking advertisement for resistance, not just in protest, but in daily life. I teach where always have this red button on, and I think that if, this is the time where, you're saving a future for your children and grandchildren, as well as yourself. Do something every day that's an act of resistance to people who are trying to destroy what so many of us have spent our lives trying to accomplish, creating a society where everybody's contribution is valued, irrespective of their chosen identities.
And now let's when we're looking at this, because Elie Wiesel, when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, part of his speech was that quote that he said, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. The opposite of art is not ugliness, it's indifference. The opposite of faith is not heresy, it's indifference. The opposite of life is not death, it's indifference. So, and that sense of do something every day, Wiesel was telling you, and Bishop Desmond Tutu also said, to be indifferent, to not do anything is to be on the side of the oppressor. So that's what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, but I don't think this is so much indifference. I think a lot of it is fear. People are genuinely afraid because they've never had to do this before. And we've never been in a situation like this. I mean, for most people who are younger than us, we're at the point where almost everybody's younger than us. They didn't live through the 60s. They didn't live through, Jim Crow. They didn't live through Selma. They didn't live through Birmingham. They didn't live through the Vietnam War. They didn't live through the Chicago Democratic Convention. So, part of our responsibility as elders is tell people there are times to preserve your own integrity. You have to step forward in ways you would never imagined and take risks you never thought were required.
And
this is that time. And this is that time to become the person you read about in books.
That's good. And we're thinking, and it's funny the way the administration is working right now. And it will lead us to a topic here that you've taken a strong stance on as a Jewish academic. So there's this piece that we're using anti-Semitism as these people, in my view, they don't care about the Jewish population.
Okay, let me go off on this. Okay, here's Colombia. You're trying to fight what you see as anti-Semitic attacks on pro-Israel students, faculty, administrators. Okay, we can debate about what's going on in those attacks. But how do you try to stop them? By defunding billions of dollars in medical research, much of which is being done by Jewish scientists.
Right.
So you're penalizing more Jews by this punitive approach than you're helping. Every university being targeted has a medical school or a huge health center attached to it, because that's where the federal grants go to. Our Fordham president, by the way, who's been great in standing up to the government and who has argued that defending DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, are an integral part of the Catholic and Jesuit tradition. But what she points out, 95% of federal grants go to STEM. And so the only way to penalize universities is to attack scientific and medical research. Who the hell does that help? You go after Johns Hopkins, Harvard, Columbia, world famous for their medical centers, medical research. Those three schools that think of the scientific discoveries associated with those three schools. All of them are having their funding cut, allegedly to prevent anti-Semitic attacks on members of their community, when a good portion of those whose grants are being canceled are in fact Jewish.
That's the point. And for me, looking at this, the anti-Semitism stance coming out of the White House is a fake shield, a cover, not to really support Jews or support Israel or support the faith. Many of these people are people that believe that if there was the second coming of Christ was to come, that only 300,000 Jews would be saved, those that converted, and all others would be damned to hell for all time. That's who these people are, Well,
look, there's a whole element in Christian Zionism which is extremely complicated and is central to the reflexive defense of Israel, which has the policy of this administration, and also, by the way, was the policy of the past one. And that's the whole fascinating question of why do Christian Zionists support Israel? But I'm not enough of an expert to spend my time talking about that here. But the bottom line is, why is the Trump administration, to allegedly discourage anti-Semitism, trying to get Harvard to cancel DEI programs, to try to change their admissions policies? In other words, the anti-Semitism accusation is a Trojan horse to try to get access to the entire university and change the way they approach race, gender, and U.S. history generally. And therefore, the best answer to this is no. The federal government has no power to dictate what goes on in classrooms, has no power to dictate what cultural clubs, may be emphasizing, and should have no power to shape university admissions. Now, but one thing let's keep in mind here, Jesse, there are probably 2,000 colleges and universities in the United States. The vast majority of whom accept almost every student who applies, and who don't have medical schools and don't have scientific research. Though the federal government has no power over those schools, there's no reason for any of them to give in to federal pressure because they don't have any leverage. Now, state governments are something else. The real danger to me, to education, if people, decide to fight back, is coming from state legislatures and governors in places like Ohio, Indiana, Florida. But so what I'm basically saying is, if you're in a blue state, do not accept a single directive in education coming from the Trump administration. Make them come after you. They don't have the lawyers, they don't have the staff. But even if we win that battle, we still have to deal with what just happened in Ohio, where the state legislature passed this awful bill, which requires every faculty member at a state university to subject their syllabi to inspection. I mean, I think we have to realize that in some ways, when the theater of what the Trump administration is doing passes, and when we effectively resist it, we still face a huge uphill battle against the Republican Party and Project 2025 in states where Republicans control the legislature and the governor's mansion. So I don't want to be I think we can beat back the federal attack. The state attacks are going to be much more difficult. But, first let's beat back the federal attack.
We say no to everything the feds are doing. It's funny because isn't this the libertarian view before this administration? Because they are very different libertarians than libertarians of the past.
Right. Well, some of the libertarians are starting to get a little upset with Trump.
Right. So
I'm seeing this a little bit in my networks,
and we're seeing and when I'm looking at it, it's interesting who his policies are hurting the most. So it's Sarah Huckabee, who was his former press secretary.
Yeah.
Who Arkansas needs FEMA money and FEMA help for tornadoes and hurricanes and floods they've had, and this is all the southern states that are North Carolina as well.
Yeah.
He has denied their funding request. So it is a point where even though, so when you said the libertarians are starting to become upset, the GOP is going to become upset because where do tornadoes, where do hurricanes, where do floods?
And where do the tariffs hit? They're going to kill American farmers. They're going to kill American truckers. And all these container ships that are not docking in California. And the trucking industry is about to be devastated.
Yep, and that's why some of that stuff, to say no, is there's the old saying, give a person enough rope and they'll hang themselves. So this is what we're really talking about here. Say no long enough. And this man will upset Southern governors by denying them FEMA. But the Medicaid that they're talking about.
They upset Wall Street with the tariffs.
Yeah.
The stock market took a dump when with a big tariff on China and then his attacks on Federal Reserve Chair.
So we're going to bring the public to understand this stance, because history, you're a history professor. I was a history teacher. History teaches us some stuff. So we've seen this playbook before. And so you can't see, but on my little, everywhere, my students know this semester that Dr. Turner always has a paperclip on.
Right.
Somewhere on my vest, on my shirt, just like you have your button. The paperclip is everywhere. So when Hitler came to power in Germany, first thing he did was disband the teachers union. He told them, "You're going to disband it. You're out of there. And what you will do, you will join my union, and you will teach a Nazi curriculum." And the Nazi curriculum wiped out everything Jewish, everything Gypsy, everything LGBTQ, everything that he somehow thought as an enemy over there. The German teachers, which historically, German teachers cannot be proud of what happened, because 97% comply. They turned in Jewish children. They turned in Jewish families. They turned in Jewish families. They told the Nazis who was homosexual. They went on there, and that's what they did. They complied, and so. But Hitler at that time, Norway, a little country who gets occupied in 1940, at the height of the Nazi power, when they were sweeping over nations, Poland, on their way to Russia, taking over France. Norway does this little thing that he tells the same thing. Their pointer puppet leader of Norway, I forget what his name is, but I remember he took that playbook from the Nazi playbook. You will disband your teachers union, and you will teach this new Nazi curriculum. And 100% of the Norwegian teachers said no. They paid a heavy price for this. Some of them lost their jobs. And when they lost their jobs, they taught their classes from the houses, in their gardens, in the parks. Some of them went to work camps. It was harsh. But what happened was they resisted. And guess what? When you said just say no, the Norwegian teachers won. They beat the Nazis at their own game. It got to the point that the Norwegian people got so discouraged by this Nazi agenda that what they did was in the cafes, anywhere a Nazi soldier, occupying soldier or official walked into a cafe, a restaurant, a church, a library, they would leave within 15 minutes. First, not the 15, they would leave immediately. The Nazi said, you can't leave. They passed the law, you can't leave until 15 minutes. So there's famous, stuff where they left.
That is a great example of what we need to do. But let's remember something. We outnumber these people.
Yes.
Okay, in all these protests outside, how many proud counter-protesters have there been? For every 1,000 people, there's 2 Proud Boys. I mean, we have them outnumbered in the streets. A lot of the Trump supporters are people sitting on their couches watching Fox News who are keyboard warriors. That's their intimidation. They like going on the email threads of black professors and trying to threaten them with their keyboards. How many, brown shirts have been marching through your neighborhood? How many Proud Boys are at your university? I haven't seen one at Fordham. There's nobody. There's no reason for us to stop doing what we're doing. And in fact, is every reason for us to magnify everything we're doing that upsets them. Just like you're describing. And I think people are catching on that the people now have the momentum, not the administration. The beginning, they bombarded us, the Bannon strategy, shock and awe.
Yeah.
Well, the shock is wearing off, and there's very little awe when we see how incompetent they are.
Yes.
My joke is they're so incompetent, they're giving fascism a bad name.
Yes, they are. And we should understand we can use these dictators as an example. So you can use Hitler. Germany did not, if it wasn't for the Marshall Act after World War II, Germany was the most devastated European nation in the history of Europe. There were no factories. There was you could buy an egg with a wheelbarrow of money, so inflationary. They were devastated. Hitler did not lead to a Third Reich. He did not lead to another 700 years of a holy empire. These people lead people to a total disaster. And that's why I was saying, when we look at FEMA, when we look at the cuts in Medicaid, when we look at the cuts in science, what these people are doing is they will lead America to a collapse, a devastating collapse.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I've spent a lot of time in Berlin, and people pointed at the end of World War II, there was no grass in the biggest park in Berlin, the Tiergarten, because people were eating it. Yeah, and they're going to, a dictator like this destroys the country. And people are, but, again, nobody expected us to get to this point. I don't know if people realized how crazy Trump was. I don't know if people realized what it meant when, Bezos, Zuckerberg, and Musk went on board. We're facing an unprecedented alliance of the right, of the Trump kleptocracy, and high tech. But still, these folks don't know what they're doing. And they're making mistake after mistake. And the Tesla boycott is devastating. It's basically driving Musk out of Washington. And the tariffs policy was a total disaster. Also, don't assume that just because Trump gives an executive order that it gets obeyed. 2 months ago, Trump ordered an end to congestion pricing in New York City. It's still going on and bringing in, tens of millions of dollars a month to the MTA that they can use to upgrade public transportation. And so just because they issue an order doesn't mean it has to be obeyed.
So my audience can understand congested pricing. This is something that's been done. It's charging people to drive in Midtown and the traffic areas over there. And what's interesting to me, this is something that London done, many cities around the world have done to reduce traffic in those areas, and they actually make the streets more pedestrian friendly. More people actually come. But what's interesting is in court this week, the Trump lawyers, they are so stupid. I mean, really stupid, that they came in. They released a document that was an internal document in their court fighting that case in New York that said we cannot win. So we have an administration that claims state rights, but then if your state thinks differently than them, your state rights don't matter in that sense. So it's kind of interesting. But yeah, incompetence after incompetence. When people ask me, I say the data of the pain of this White House will come in April, May, June, July, and August. Those cuts that they're talking about are so devastating. We won't know who doesn't get the Medicaid assistance. We won't know that until the summer right now, because you got to finish.
Imagine you're living in West Virginia and their Medicaid cuts. The whole hospital system could collapse.
Right, and they're rural.
That's the reddest of red states.
Right, and they're rural people who, if it wasn't for that Medicaid assistance, they wouldn't have transportation to the clinics that are 2 and 3 hours away. You and I. Right. I live in near Hartford, Connecticut. It's 3 minutes to the hospital. It's I've been to your house. I could walk to the house down the block over there. They don't have that, and so all of this stuff that they're doing is starting to come out. The tariffs, the cost, and the constant lies. So when Hitler said, "Tell a big lie long enough," and they'll start to believe it. He keeps talking about the price of eggs are going down. Well, he said they're lower than they ever were. Well, I don't guess the man is paying attention.
But just let me give you another example of something unexpected. So President Trump has been invited to give the commencement address at the University of Alabama, more than 5,000 students have signed a petition at the University of Alabama asking them to rescind the invitation. Who would have thought that you get 5,000 students at the University of Alabama to do that?
And that's that's a great example of us just saying no. As students, we can say no. And one of the parts of your question that we began with, what can we do as individuals, kind of, but now as members of organizations, you said we can go underground, but also student organizations. I mean, they're not underground. So the student government is an all-out university. They could write statements. They can write resolutions. They could say no to all of this. They can organize, as you said, icebreakers on their campus. We already know.
The other thing is, and this hasn't happened yet, but a whole lot of people could say, I'm not going to play football or basketball for a school that abolishes DEI and defunds Black history.
Well, that could be Ohio State made long.
Yeah, I mean, that hasn't happened yet, but just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it won't happen in a year from now.
And I could transfer. I could be at a university. We've had people, you transfer, you don't lose that year of eligibility.
Yeah, and not only, you also get paid for it.
Connecticut,
so we're just at the beginning of this resistance. The other thing is, take it home. If I knew who were the people who were going to try to, tell Harvard to defund their DEI programs, I'd find out where they live and picket their houses.
Isn't that what they do? Isn't that
that's what they've done, but
what they do.
What's good for the goose is good for the gander.
So we could certainly.
We're going to get stronger and stronger and stronger when we see how incompetent they are, and also as people who once support them start to see that their lives are falling apart. Look, I saw this with the Vietnam War, and let me give you an example. In 1967, I marched in my first anti-war protest at Columbia. And there were maybe 300 people marching against the war. And the other side of the fence were like 200 athletes screaming racial and anti-Semitic slurs at the marchers. I won't say what they said because it'll offend you. But I was part of a group of about 7 people with signs that said "Jocks for Peace." I knew all the people on the other side of the fence. In 1970, when the United States invaded Cambodia, the whole Columbia football team went on strike. And every one of those guys who were on the other side of the fence had become anti-war. So don't assume that people can't change when circumstances require it. But in the beginning, some people have to take a stance and be willing to take the flak.
So we take it home, we take a stance, and we already know it's sort of, I used to tell people that every tsunami began with a single drop of rain somewhere in the world.
Every tsunami, that's a great quote. Every tsunami begins with a single. And then also, when you do take a stand, people will eventually come up to you and maybe want to start a conversation. They felt one thing at one point, now they're beginning to doubt. And if they know you and they know where you stand, they may come up to you and start a conversation. Be open to those conversations, because that's going to be part of what will eventually turn this all around.
And we must be conscious of the greatest tool of oppressors, regardless of what side they're coming from, is our silence and our apathy. Because that's what we're talking about today. Just say no, do something, say something, speak up, stand up, put a sign up.
Put a sign up, wear a button, wear a t-shirt.
By the way, I need one of those buttons.
Oh no, when you come to Brooklyn, I have a bunch for you.
I'm gonna be coming to Brooklyn because you got all the good bagels and all the good food.
All right, yeah.
But so we this piece, it's sort of like in 19 '68. My grandfather was the shop steward. He was 68 years old. He was retiring. In '68, Dr. King called for a march on Washington. My grandfather went to the Union Hall. He had a brand new car, a '63 Dodge Dart with push button. It was really cool, red leather seats. He said, "I will drive us to D.C." And nobody at the Union Hall said they would go. He went to church. He was a deacon in the church.
Yeah.
He went to the church. He said, this is a march on what, and nobody would go. My grandmother and my mother, they were so afraid because people forget that wherever black people had assembled in the '60s, there was usually violence associated. They did not want him to go. And they might have even been the ones that said not to do it, and that's that. But I want to get back to this beat. So no matter what, he went. And before he went, the night before he went, my mother calls my grandmother and says, "Listen, he's so old that he'll fall asleep driving down there because you got to drive from New Jersey to D.C." They're worried about him, and they're like, so what they did was they said, make him take the boy. The boy, I was 8 years old, Mark, 8 years old. Take the boy because he'll keep him awake. He never shuts up. And so what happens is, and so what I'm saying is, my grandfather was just one person. And as we know, there's 250,000 to 500,000 people in D.C. But imagine it's sort of like Selma, Congressman Lewis in Selma. There was SNCC. I mean, we really don't have many people crossing that Edmund Pettus Bridge over there. So what I'm saying to people now, what I'd like them to understand is, get on the ground floor, get in the historical ground floor of the resistance so that you can say when your grandchildren, and you're already saying this to them, but I don't have any yet, but to our grandchildren and my students' grandchildren can say, we resisted, we said no. And this is the ground floor. Now, Mark, we probably have about maybe 2.5 minutes. You'll kind of give us your final take on give us the good news, because I'd say this is the good news.
Okay, let me give you some good news from Fordham. First of all, our university president came out and said, in response to the Trump administration's attempt to shut down DEI, DEIB is in the Catholic and Jesuit tradition, and you have no right to tell us to violate our most cherished beliefs. And a number of Catholic schools around the country are taking this stance. You can take that stance as an individual. It's my this is an expression of my religious and spiritual convictions. So she took a stance. Then we had 4 students, international students, whose visas were canceled. We had several professors whose research grants were defunded. And a group of my young colleagues at Fordham, who had been silent during the first month of Trump's second term, got together and formed a concerned faculty group, and where they organized a community solidarity rally on campus, which will meet next Wednesday. These were folks who were all, scared for the first month when I was stepping forward. Now they're stepping forward. And I'm chairing the rally, but I'm not speaking at it because there are 10 of them willing to speak out. Nothing could make me feel better. I feel less pressure now because they're stepping forward. And this is just the beginning. So every time you step forward, it's like a ripple in a pond and gives somebody else the courage to do it. And there are more of us than there are of them. We have history. We have justice on our side. We have teachings of the great religions on our side. So let's keep saying no to injustice and yes to justice and community.
And why not? Why not join us?
Why not join us?
Badass teacher, badass parent, badass grandparent, badass child. Let us be the badass resistors. I love it. I love it. So so when I'm thinking about this, because we're still waiting for the music over there, so we got a couple of seconds over there. What is a badass teacher? How do I become a badass teacher?
You defend your students, you defend your colleagues, you defend the tradition of teaching that you represent. And you do so without fear. And you do so without compromise.
And isn't that what teacher means? Teacher.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse.
Just say no.
Just say no.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop. Children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's